my granny.
This is my grandmother.
And this is my grandma.
Seniors are very important.
I love you, Babcha. We need you.
You are loved.
When the sun is bright or in the darkest night, we're all in this together. I've got many friends, and you are one of them. We're all in this together. It will be okay. Ça va bien aller. I've got many songs to sing, won't you? Sing them too, sing them too.
Hi, my name is Graham Calder. Welcome to this tutorial on gardening in small spaces. So I know a lot of you elders are out there living in an apartment with a small balcony or maybe a little backyard space, or maybe you don't even have a balcony and you've just got plants inside your home. So today what we're going to be looking at is various different ways that we can maximize our ability to grow plants indoors or on that small balcony space. So to give you a little bit of a background of who I am and how I ended up here today, I'm actually from Nova Scotia and grew up on 72 acres in the middle of the woods and moved to Montreal about 20 years ago. Now, only when I moved to Montreal in the concrete jungle did I really realize how much plant life, animal life, and being exposed to the outdoors meant to me. I went through a really hard time in my first few years of university in a tiny apartment with no plants and no park nearby, and I ended up actually getting a plant as a gift from a friend. Now this one plant was one of these calamondin orange trees, these beautiful little ornamental oranges, and I saved every seed from that and planted them out, and by the end of the year I had 15 orange trees, and my mood and depression started to go away. So I began actually getting into the field of environment, plants, and all of this, which has led me to founding the company P3 Permaculture, which does consultation and design and workshops in gardening, farming, and how to make your life more ecological. And now we offer these kind of workshops to people like you to get you growing. So some of the materials that we're going to need for today's tutorial are very easily found in your own home, or if not, you can find them at a local thrift store, dollar store, or your hardware store. The first of these ingredients is going to be a geotextile membrane, also known as a root barrier or garden fabric, or landscaper's cloth. So this is very easy to find at a hardware store, and it's going to be what we're going to make our grow bag out of today. It's important to not use cotton. I've done this before with an old pillowcase, which is great, recycling old material. However, within a month or two, the entire thing biodegrades and you've got a big mess on your hands. So make sure it is actually a landscaper's cloth that is made out of recycled PET. The next thing that we're going to need is a pair of scissors. Make sure they're good and sharp for cutting fabric. It's always a pain when you've got dull scissors and you're trying to cut through some tissue. The next thing that you're going to need is a sewing machine. Now, don't freak out. Most of us don't have a sewing machine at home. Some of us still do. If you do, that's great, and you can do all of this on your sewing machine. And if you don't, a very simple workaround is to get a stapler, and we're going to use this to actually close the seams on our grow bag today. You can also use a hot glue gun. If you do use a hot glue gun, though, make sure that you don't get the really thin geotextile because it'll melt straight through it. You need a much more thick material, which you can still get at hardware stores, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find. So that's only if you're using the hot glue gun. So the next thing you're going to need is something to take a measure with. You can either use a sewing measuring tape. Mine's a little bit worse for wear, but this is great because it's flexible and you're going to be able to measure the circumference of your pot. But you can also use a piece of string and then measure that on a ruler after you've got your right measurement. So you're going to need something to get your measure. And then what I like to use is either a white pencil crayon if you have it, a piece of hotel soap, you know, this cheap soap that you actually don't want to use on your body. It's great for sewing and black fabrics. It works great, and then when you wash it, it disappears. Or you can use a piece of chalk. So any of these white writing implements is going to be great for marking out your pattern. So to recap quickly, we're going to need something to mark on our fabric. We're going to need something to cut our fabric, make sure they're good and sharp, something to measure out our container and then make our pattern, and something to fasten it together, whether it's the stapler, sewing machine, or the hot glue gun. And finally, you're going to need your geotextile or landscape fabric to actually make the pot. This is all of what we need to make the actual grow bag. The next thing that you're going to need is some form of a reservoir. So when I say reservoir, I don't mean a garden plant pot that has drainage. I say reservoir because I want us to think and remember that it has to hold water. So a cache-pot is what we call it in French, but a pot cover, which is usually a drip tray that covers the pot to make it look prettier, is going to be great for this. Make sure you water test it first. It's always a bummer when you find out the hard way that there's a leak. So make sure you do a water test. You can get some silicone and seal it up if it doesn't actually fully seal. But you're going to be using this to be our water reservoir, but also to make your geotextile grow bag look a little nicer. And the last thing that we're going to need is a small yogurt container. And depending on the size of your reservoir, you're going to want to choose a different size container. So some yogurt containers are going to be a lot taller. In this setup, if we had a taller one, the pot would actually stick up and out, and I don't like the way that that looks. So I've chosen these smaller ones here, which gives me still a good amount of water reservoir, and it gives my plant pot flush height with the pot cover. So right now is a good moment to pause the video, look in the description for the list of these ingredients or on the screen, and go and gather everything that you're going to need to follow along with us. And feel free during the video to pause anytime you need to catch up to where we are, and you can always replay the video or just rewind a little bit if you missed a small part. So the list of supplies that you're going to need are also going to be posted on the We're All in This Together Facebook page. So no worries, you've got all the materials listed in multiple places. We're going to get you through this, and by the end, you're going to have a beautiful pot that takes care of itself growing in your windowsill. So we're going to actually get started with understanding a bit about the plants that we have at home. Many people think that they don't have a green thumb, but in fact a green thumb is something that you have to grow yourself. What I mean by this is you're not born with it. It's something about learning the relationship that we have to plants. You have to treat them as a friend or a companion. If you don't know what their needs are, you're never going to be able to take care of them or help them out when they're having a rough time. So what are the needs of a plant? Many of us are going to think, okay, well, plants need sunlight, they need some nutrients and fertilizer, they need some water. But when we actually go and look at our plants indoors, we're providing these elements in a very strange way. For example, we look at our beautiful pink hyacinth here. This plant requires water. As in nature, it would get water from the rain. But that's not where plants get most of their water. Plants will get the rain to recharge the groundwater aquifer, and they'll send roots down to pull that moisture up when they need it. So is this pot providing a groundwater source of water? Not really. What's the other thing that this plant needs? It needs root growth. It needs a space to grow its roots out so that it can gather nutrients. And in these types of pots, we often add fertilizer because we believe that our plants require nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in order for them to grow strong, which is partially true. Those three nutrients are three of more than 175 micro and trace nutrients that this beautiful little plant needs to thrive. So what we're going to be doing today is learning how to recreate a soil system that's just like the soil system we see out in our gardens and in the forest, full of life and providing those nutrients without any effort on our part. So this pot requires inputs of water, inputs of fertilizer, and when we look at the way the roots grow, they're actually contained in this plastic pot, which is not great for the plant. If you look at how plant roots grow in nature, they'll only ever encounter a hard surface like this when they encounter a rock. And their strategy to get around that is to literally go around the rock. So what do these beautiful little roots do? They get stuck behind the rock and they keep looking for how to get around it, how to get around it, how to get around it, and then you end up with a root-bound pot. This root circling that happens can actually constrict the entire root mass and even kill off your plants. So these containers that are fully sealed with a few drainage holes are really not great for the roots. So we're going to look at a way that we can grow roots in a much more natural fashion that's going to provide them with the ability to grow a much more dense root mass, which actually allows you to grow 5 times more plant in the exact same pot. So this means you can get a lot more garden in your tiny little green space. So now that we're making friends with our plants and we've just learned a little bit more about what their actual needs are, we're going to now move into how to fulfill those needs with our self-sufficient garden plant pot. So when we look at the needs of the water of the plant, I mentioned that the water comes from down below. Sometimes we have a bit of rainwater coming for our plants, but most of the time they're sourcing it down below. So you might have noticed in your garden centers, in your hardware stores, and many other places, there's all kinds of different self-watering garden pots that are out there. And these are a great step, but they only meet one of the needs of our new friends. So these little self-watering plant pots, this is just a tiny example, they have a reservoir underneath and they have holes in the bottom of the pot which allow the roots to go and get their water. And the plants have 2 different forms of roots. They have a nutritive root that's looking for nutrients, and they have a water root that actually goes down and gets water. So they'll send their water roots down here, and that's a great start. We've got some water self-sufficiency. But there's nothing in here that's going to provide a living soil ecosystem that will feed our plants and fend off disease and bacteria. And there's nothing in here that's going to aerate the soil, giving us more root volume and that ability to grow more plants in the same small space. Right here in our plant pot example, we have a reservoir, as the self-watering pots do. We're going to have a reservoir of water here, and we need to make sure that this pot is not sitting in that reservoir, because if it's too wet in that reservoir, it's actually going to cause root rot. And for any of you at home who have ever killed a houseplant, most of the time, and they actually did a study on this, 80% of all the houseplants that are ever killed are caused by root rot. And this is because whenever our plant is a little bit sick or a little bit wilted or has an insect, we tend to think, oh, maybe it needs more water. Or some of us are very regimented and we put a watering schedule on our calendar, and every Wednesday we water our plants. But in fact, we need to learn how the plants need water, when they need water, and sometimes you're more thirsty than not. And that's what the plants are like in the winter or the summer. In the summer, they need a lot more water. In the winter, they don't. So if you're watering every Wednesday all year round, some of the months you may be giving not enough water, and some of the months you'll be giving too much, which is why the creation of this self-watering reservoir is so important, because the plant will decide itself if it needs to go get more water. And you're not the one that is on the hook for ensuring that those needs are met in the varying temperatures, sunlight availability, and seasons of the year. So the first trick that you need to learn before we get anywhere into this is when you are going to water a houseplant at home, if it's not a self-watering plant pot, because many of you will still have lots of these other pots at home, there is a 2-knuckle trick that I like to use. You actually need to put your finger 2 knuckles deep into the soil, and I don't mean just touch the soil, 2 knuckles deep all the way, and if it's still bone dry at that depth, then you can water your plants. If it's still a little bit moist at that depth, then you've got ample moisture for those roots to grow. And I know many of you will do this and realize that you've been overwatering your plants. So if you had killed plants in the past, it's not your fault. It's because we didn't know what our friends needed. So now that we know how to provide our water with a reservoir, we need to learn how to give that aeration to our plants. And what we're doing is we're using this geotextile membrane. This is a pre-made pot that you can actually order online. They are very affordable. They're coming pre-made and they're in a cylinder. So this is an aerated pot. It's much more robust material, but it's very similar to what we're going to be making today with our tutorial. This provides a full aeration all around the roots, and what you end up with is a very dense root mass and that ability for these plants to grow much bigger in a small space. So that's how we're going to provide the needs of soil aeration. So now that we've learned about our self-watering reservoir, we need to learn how to make our plants have living soil. And so when we think about controlling disease, controlling insects, and controlling mushrooms or bad mushrooms or fungi, it's important to understand the relationship that they have in the soil. And first of all, whenever we put a spray to kill an insect, or we put a spray to prevent a bacterial wilt or a fungal dampening off, we end up actually fighting against the general population. And what survives is the bad guys. So when we think about how soil exists in nature, there is no sterile soil out there. The only sterile soil that we find is here in our plant pots. And so this dry, dusty soil is not the perfect condition to provide all of what our little plant friends need. So how do we get that plant friend all of the nutrients it needs from a living soil? We need to understand that the soil in nature is full of beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria, and beneficial insects. These populations of the good guys, when they're strong, they eat and kill back all of the bad ones that we end up having as pest problems or disease problems. So if we encourage these little soil workers for us, they'll actually defend our plants for us, and we don't have to worry about as many disease or pest outbreaks. So when we start with this dusty soil mix, we need to look at how to bring it back alive. So to get started with that, you're going to need some kind of a source of organic matter. So here I have this is the dry remnants of yerba mate, which is a plant that has caffeine in it that comes from Uruguay or Argentina that I drink a lot of. So I produce a lot of this as a waste material that normally would go in the compost. You may have green tea or black tea. These leaves are fine as long as you dry them first and crumble them up, and don't put them on your plants wet, but that source of organic matter is going to be crucial for you. This is a sample of that same organic matter, but 2 months later. And you can see here, it's already a darker color. It's a little bit more moist. It holds together in these clumps. And these clumps are because of the small fungal strands in here, the strands of beneficial mushrooms. Also the gels and colloids, the sticky bits that are left behind from the insects and the bacteria, and all of those other components that are actually breaking down this material. So they're literally eating this material and turning it into a rich soil. And if you look, it's moist and it's starting to smell like the soil that we have in our garden or in the forest floor. And the final result of the process of decomposition in our living soil garden bins is a beautiful, rich, living soil. And if you look closely here, you can actually see little critters moving. And those tiny little white guys, if you can see them, are called springtails. And springtails are one of the most important little garden allies because they're the mold patrol. So if you look here, there's really abundance of life crawling around, and it's those little critters there that are going to be eating the organic matter and adding their manure, adding their fertilizer to the soil, so that this plant has now over 175 micro and trace nutrients that are going to provide every single benefit that we need for the garden. The next little component that I'm going to plug here, which is a really important one, is using mycorrhizae. Now, mycorrhizae is simply a type of fungi or mushroom that is in the soil that connects with the roots of the plants. And they've actually found that over 70% of all plants on Earth are requiring mycorrhizae in the soil to actually grow and thrive. The mycorrhizae connects with the roots of all the plants and actually shares nutrients from one plant plant to the next, and they become an ecosystem. So these are some crucial elements about how to connect plants together with living soil and their own groundwater system, so that really you have a micro ecosystem sitting on your balcony and not just a plant sitting in a dry plant pot. This mycorrhizae can be found in hardware stores under the product called Myke, M-Y-K-E. And I don't plug a lot of products, but this one is an amazing thing to have in your repertoire so that you can put a little bit in each of your garden plant pots. All right, now that you've got all your materials ready and in front of you, we're going to get started. So the first thing that you're going to need right now is your geotextile membrane, your implement for drawing out your pattern, something for measuring, and the pot that you have chosen. So whether you are using the same style of pot or something that you found at your hardware store or maybe in your cupboards, basically what we need to do is make sure that we measure this properly in order to have a plant pot that will fit. Now we want to have a little bit of space. So see how this plant pot is actually a little bit smaller than the actual container. This means that we have airflow around, which is going to help with that aeration. If it's a big plant pot that actually fits very, very loosely in here and therefore is stuck up against the edge, well then we're simply recreating the same conditions of the plant pot that has no aeration at all. So we want it to be a little bit smaller than your pot. So what I like to do for that is I actually measure the circumference of the smaller portion of the pot, or the lower part of the pot. Now if you have a pot that's perfectly cylindrical and doesn't have any taper whatsoever, then you're going to want to go just about an inch or a centimeter and a half, 2.5 centimeters less than that diameter. So we're going to start with that first. So you take your pot, you can take your flexible measuring tape. If you only have a regular measuring tape at home or a ruler, you're going to do this with a piece of string, and then you're going to tie a knot at the measurement and measure what that is. So we're just going to wrap this around and get our measure. And so here you can see we have 18 inches. And the reason why I'm measuring it like this is because we're not actually going to be making a perfect cylinder. We're going to be cheating. It's a very simple way of making a plant pot, because this is a little more complicated to measure the cylinder, cut it out, and then measure a circle and sew that in. So if you're not familiar with sewing, if it's new to you or you're using the stapler or the hot glue gun, this can be a little bit more tricky. So what we're doing is a pillowcase, basically. We are going to do a rectangle that has that 18-inch is the circumference, and so the width that we're going to be using is half of that. So we're going to use that half of the width, and we're going to double the length of our pot, fold it over, and then you only have 2 seams to sew together. So the length that we need here is not the full length of the pot, which in my case would be 9 inches. It is the full length of the pot minus half of the reservoir. We don't want to go all the way to 7 inches, because then you won't have anything hanging over the edge that touches the water, which is going to be what's wicking the moisture up to the pot. And you don't want to go the full 9 inches, because you have then a lot of it hanging in the bottom. So we're going to go for the 8 inches of length. So get your material and lay it out in front of you. And what I like to do when I get started with this is right away find yourself a fold, or fold yourself a seam, and that's going to be the bottom of your pillowcase, right? So you start with a fold and fold it forward. So make sure you measure twice, cut once. This is always a great guideline for any time you're doing sewing and construction. So we're going to make sure that we have the right measurement here. So you're doing 8 inches because we have a reservoir that comes up to 7. But we actually want some of our our geotextile to be dangling down into the reservoir. So we're going to go to 8 inches here, and that's going to give us a little extra to dangle down. If you don't have that part of your grow bag that's dangling down, then you're not going to have any water wicking up. So if you're not making your own geotextile fabric pot and you are buying one of these online, when we look at how this is set up, if you've got water in your reservoir here, there isn't any of the pot that's actually touching that water. So what we have to do is we have to create a wick that is going to bring the water to the bottom of the pot. And so I simply do that by cutting a small strip of this fabric. that is going to dangle over the pot, and that provides a wick surface so that when this geotextile gets wet, it wicks moisture up to the bottom of the pot, and the plant will then wick the moisture up to the roots. The soil will wick the moisture up to the roots of the plant, and the plants actually can sense moisture as well. So they'll start growing in the direction of the water, and they may even come out of this, even though they call it a root membrane or a root barrier, it doesn't block roots. They're going to grow out of this pot and into the water a little bit. So if you're buying these online, you do need to have this little extra bit of fabric that is going to be your wick for you. All right, so you're going to want a square edge of your fabric. If you don't have a square edge, you can also just fold it over and give yourself a hem. This is going to give you a little bit of a stronger edge, or you can just cut yourself a new straight edge to work with. If you're actually hemming, you want to add that to your measurement. So I'm going to be hemming over this by about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to make sure that I mark that extra hem material. So I'm going to start my measurement from this mark, which included the hem, right? So you're going to add that on so that you don't lose that by making a smaller pot. It's basically called a seam allowance. So we're going to have that there. We're going to start our measurement from that point, and we're going to go all the way to 8 inches. And we're going to make another mark. Now this doesn't have to be absolutely precise. See how great that soap is? It's better than the chalk, better than the pencil crayon. It's really what you got to do. My grandmother taught me that trick. So you've got your 8 inches of length here, and what we need to do now is bring the fold of your fabric to that 8-inch point, right? So we're going to roll it back until we've got our fold there. And now we're not, basically the reason why I'm doing this is it means we don't have to make another seam down here. So you're saving a little bit of work, and it makes a stronger pot. So that is our length. Now we're going to go for the width. And remember, we measured the width by doing the circumference of the smaller part of our pot, which for us was 18 inches. So we're going to go 9 as our width. And this is where we have to remember to do the seam allowance again. So I'm going to mark 9, but we're going to be adding a little bit because with this thin fabric, if we were just to sew like this, it's not very strong. So we want to actually fold it over and have a double thickness when we're sewing our seams. Now that is going to be width that you will lose if you don't include it in the extra measurement. So make sure I'm going to put, what is it here? I'm going to put a full inch seam allowance on both sides, so our measurement of 9 now becomes 11. So we're going to add that on, and that gives us extra room to work with. And as you see, we don't need perfect straight lines here. If any of these steps are moving a little too fast for you, you can always pause the video, get caught up, and then start again and follow along. And feel free to rewatch the video as many times as you need so that you can have your pot done by the end. So, there we've got our cut. Now we've got our cut, and it's a lot wider than we need, right? So remember, when we're going to do the seam, we are going to give ourselves that seam allowance. So that is going to give us a much stronger pot to start. And what we're going to do is I like to get started with our beautiful Singer sewing machine here with one staple at the top and one at the bottom. And this is basically, you can use your own basting pins if you have them, but if you don't have a sewing setup at home, you're not gonna go to the dollar store just to buy basting pins to do this little workshop. So you're gonna just give yourself these 2 staples to give us a head start and to get everything solidified. So then we're gonna go to the other side and we're gonna do the same thing. I like to do this as well because you can mock it up and do a test fit to your pot to make sure that you didn't mess up any of the measurements. And sometimes what you'll realize is if your pot has a very steep taper, then maybe actually a straight rectangle is going to look really tiny inside. So you may actually want to add a bit of taper to it. So this is a good moment to test what you've already come up with to then see how that fits as a pot. So you can see that as we have the reservoir, this is going to sit over top, and the corners are going to actually dangle down. So those filled with soil that has a bit of the perlite in it. So if you're not familiar with perlite, it's these little kind of styrofoamy, crunchy bits. They're not actually styrofoam, only the cheapest nurseries use styrofoam. It's actually a geological material, it's a rock material that is in your plant soil that gives you aeration. So make sure you have that because it's going to give you better drainage. When we look at how this sets up, we have a bit of the corners that are going to dangle down, we have our pot that's going to come up, and it's about the right height, right? So we've got our measurements down. I realize actually I probably could have given myself a little extra length on that seam allowance to be able to give me a little bit more height, because it's going to come in just a bit below the surface when I do that. So now we're going to finish off the pot. So I'm going to continue these edges since I know that they are good. And you don't need to, go crazy with the staples here. As when you double it over like this, you actually prevent the soil from passing out. So you can go one staple every inch. Very simple. If you have a sewing machine, make sure you don't use cotton thread. It needs to be a polyester thread. The cotton will surprise you halfway through the growing season when it decides to decompose as the living soil breaks it down because it's natural material, and your garden pot falls apart on you. We've got our seams. Now we're going to just do the other one quickly. All right, we've got our side seams done. Now what I'm going to do is do the top seam allowance, just to give it a more finished edge. It always looks a little bit nicer. I'll just fold that over. And when you do this part, you actually want to keep your staples closer to the lower part of the edge, because if you're at the top edge here, they're going to be more visible. Again, same thing if you're using a sewing machine, you're going to do that as well. If you get really close to the edge of the fabric with a sewing machine, you're going to want to use a zigzag stitch. That will prevent it from fraying and give it a lot more stability. And the last one. All right, now that we've got all of our seams done, we're going to pop it inside out and give us a little bit more of a clean look. Not that you're going to see this anyway, but it still looks a little bit nicer. And there's our pillowcase geotextile grow bag. So, assembling this, we're going to first do a water test on your container. Make sure that it's good and sealed. If there's any leaks along the seams on the inside, you can buy a tube of silicone from a home hardware store or any hardware store, and you just want to put a little bit of silicone around those seams. Make sure that you get it nice and watertight. You don't want these things leaking on your countertops, on your nice wood floors, because the goal is to have a reservoir of water that is always full. And what I do now is, instead of every Wednesday watering your plants, I do every Wednesday check my reservoirs and make sure your reservoirs are always full, and that way the plants always have something to drink if they're thirsty. When we water our plants, and this works for your reservoir as well as any other plant, put your water in a bucket or in a pitcher for 24 hours if it's coming from a municipal water supply, because that will actually let the chlorine evaporate from the water, because the chlorine is in our pipes to kill bacteria, and we're actually trying to grow beneficial bacteria here to grow better plants. So once you've water tested your bin, we're going to find a container like this. If you just put this in there like it is right now, it's going to keep floating up on you, and it's not going to work because it's going to hold your plant a little bit too high out of the water. So what we need to do is you need to take your scissors and very carefully punch some holes in it. And this is also why I keep the lid on as well. It gives it a little extra stability once those holes are punched. So this is basically to give extra drainage and also some more contact for the roots if they do get to this surface so that they can grow down into the water. But I'm going to also put a couple holes on the side. So be very careful when you're doing this. You do not want to cut yourself. You can also use a drill bit. If you have a drill at home, it's going to be a lot easier than the scissors. The scissors can have a tendency to slip. Do not do this with an X-Acto. The X-Actos are way too sharp and you'll very often slip and cut yourself. So we're going to keep going. Any steak knife will work for this as well. Even the tip of your garden shears or anything. You can. There's many different ways you can punch a hole in this. It doesn't need to be clean. You just need the air to not be trapped and this to fill with water. So I'm actually going to even put a few on the lid here just to ensure that we have a good flow of water through this. Now, when you're doing this, you'll notice sometimes after a few months that there's actually, it gets a little bit slimy in here. The water maybe isn't so nice. So you can actually pull the pot up and out. You can pull out your support and you can give the entire pot a wash. So this is a really nice way of doing it because it's something that's very easily disassembled and reassembled for maintenance without having to take your pot out of the plant pot and repot everything. So it means that it's very easy to maintain. And also those slimes, if they smell bad, then you definitely have to clean it. It's not good. You don't want it. It means most likely you've got the water level is higher than the reservoir top. If you put the water level higher than your reservoir top and your plant pot is sitting in water, then the soil is going to go anaerobic and it's going to rot, just like that stinky compost. And so if it ever has a bad smell, then you're putting too much water in the reservoir. So always make sure that you can see that the water is not above the support container. And if you do see those slimy gels and there is no smell, that slime, it's not very nice, but it is the beneficial bacteria that are living in that water, just like you may see on the side of a riverbed or a stream bed. So we assemble this, we put it together, and now we need to fill our pot and get our pink hyacinth in to the pot. So now when we get started, we want to make sure that we are going to have enough soil so that the plant pot is not too far down. But again, we don't want it to be soil all the way to the top either, because we are going to be adding a layer of this organic material. So we want to make sure that there is room for the organic matter on the top. So we're going to fill this to about just below, maybe a ½ an inch or 1.5 centimeters below the seam allowance line here, giving me a nice 1.5 inches of space to play with. So first of all, we're going to look at our pink hyacinth and see how the roots are doing. You can see already when we flip it over, the roots are trying to escape through those little holes, right? This is showing me that the roots need more space. So this is a beautiful example of root circling or root bound plant. This plant for a long time has been waiting for something bigger than what it has. So it's been asking for help and no one's been listening, right? So now we've got this new design. These will never circle like this again because when they hit the side of our fabric pot, the root will air prune, which is the technical term for it, and that will cause it to, instead of having one long root like this, it'll make thousands of micro root hairs off of those big main roots, and that is what provides the extra root volume. If we were just to put this in the pot as it is, these roots are not going to do anything. They're going to stay dormant. So you actually have to, I know it's a little unnerving sometimes doing this, and you will break a few roots. Some plants really hate this. If you're working with pumpkin or any of the cucurbit family seedlings, they absolutely hate this. You have to seed them direct in the ground. They do not want their roots touched ever, but most plants will thank you for it. And so we're going to loosen these up and make sure we have a little bit more spread, because then we are going to spread them out in our pot. So the soil I'm using here is actually some soil that we had from a leftover plant. So it's not in great condition, but we're going to bring it back. If you don't have any soil at home, you don't have a pot that's dyed that you can recycle the soil from, you're going to go to your local garden center or hardware store. And I prefer the Pro Mix. I find them really good quality. And there's even a Pro Mix that has mycorrhizae already in it. You can still add the mic if you want, and I like to do this as an extra safety, but just the Pro Mix with mycorrhizae from the hardware store will be perfect for this. So I first put in a base layer of that soil on the bottom. And remember, this is just soil that isn't living. It's basically your substrate to grow the plant, but we want to bring it back to life. So this is where I'm going to take a sample of nice soil from the garden. And to know if this is good soil that has life in it, there's a little trick that we're going to do here, and it's called the crumb test. Now, again, this is stuff that we go into in our other trainings, but the crumb test means when you clump the ball together and you kind of lightly push it, it should crumble apart like that and make big cookie crumbs, right? So that's a good sign. That shows you that there are glues or gels and colloids from the bacteria in here. That means it's good soil. So if you can grab a sample of soil from the park or from the garden or from one of your friends' balcony gardens, and it does this, then this is going to be your inoculum. So we're going to take that nice living soil and we're going to add it to the mix. And so I like to put it in little bits of layers because it's going to be our inoculum. So we want that life to spread out. I also have this partially decomposed organic matter that I have from my other pot. So this can be, if you found a nice pile of shredded leaves that were starting to decompose, you can grab some of that. This is a great project for if you have any grandchildren or nieces and nephews or anything like that, to get them out digging up old, composting leaves. It's probably something they would love to do, and maybe not something everyone loves to do. So we add some of that to the mix. And again, more soil. And now we're about at 2/3 of the pot full, which is probably going to be just enough to give me the space I want for this hyacinth. And so actually what I've done here is I've put too much soil. So I'm going to take some out because you see how long these roots are? We want to kind of put them down deeper in the pot and then fill up around them. So that's going to give us a more spread root ball from the beginning. So I'll hold this here and lightly spread the roots out, and I'm holding it up high like this until I fill the soil up to here. And that will just allow for those roots to kind of spread out through the soil as we are filling it up. Now, make sure, one thing we didn't mention when you're doing this, that you've got a tarp down or a nice waterproof tablecloth, or you're doing this outside because you're going to make a mess, no matter how much you try not to. I think if you try, the harder you try to not make a mess, the more mess you make. It's probably the rule of gardening. And we're going to add a little bit more of that living soil from the garden or the forest, and a little bit more of that decomposed stuff. And you can actually see here another one of our red wriggler worms. So they're going to be feasting on this organic matter. They're going to be patrolling for root rot and preventing that root rot from affecting our plants. And we're going to top it off with the remainder of our soil. So tamp it down, but don't push too hard. When you do that, you're likely to actually break those fragile roots. You see how fragile they are? I broke some of these by accident, but they're very delicate. So the more you push down on a plant when you're transplanting it, or even in the garden, the more likely you are to actually severely damage those roots. So I always put a little bit more, because once this gets its first watering, it will actually settle down a fair bit. And when we do these plant pots, I know that they're self-watering from the bottom, but we do give it a first good watering from the top in order to hydrate the soil mix, settle down those air bubbles, and get the system started, and then we'll fill up the reservoir. So you can see I've given myself a good amount of space on the top here to apply my organic matter. So remember, this is the yerba mate leaves, and you can actually just buy yerba mate from any Latino grocery store, and many grocery stores carry it nowadays. Or you can save your green tea or black tea leaves. Make sure they're not fruit blends of tea, because the fruit will actually attract fruit flies, that fruit odor. So just straight green tea or black tea, or if you can't find any of those, again, another great project for grandchildren or nieces or nephews, or when you're on your next walk, is to grab a handful of dry leaves and crush them up and use them as your top mulch. So we're going to use this as our top mulch here. And really give it extra. You're really going for a nice thick layer, because you'll see as the months go on, this top mulch will start to disappear because it will be turning into food for those soil organisms. So here you go. I'm going to dust it off. This is our plant pot ready to go in. And you can see we got our measurements almost perfect. It's just high enough that we've maximized the space that we're using, but we don't see a lot of the plant edges. Now for this size of a pot, I would actually add in here some pothos or devil's ivy or some English ivy or something like that around the edges here, because it will grow and dangle over the edge and completely hide this fabric pot that's in here. And because we have the aerated pot, we now can put a lot more plants in the same small space. All right, so we just saw how to put this together and get your plant set up in the aerated pot. And this is just if we're doing one single plant, but you can obviously have multiple different plants in here because we have this aeration, and that allows for a lot more root mass in the same size pot. If you're doing one single plant, it means that you can have a bigger plant with a smaller pot than you would normally expect because it allows for that extra root volume. So we're gonna actually add a few other plants to this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to remove the mulch, the top mulch. And this is a way of also, if you wanted to have, if you had a plant at home and you only had one plant that you wanted to put in your aerated pot, you could do one plant, and then you can also, as you get other plants, add them to the mix. So this is how you would do it. You remove your mulch. We don't want to stir it too much into the subsoil because we want it to be on the surface. So now we've created some room. So I'm just going to pull this out. And we are going to add a basil because it's always nice to have a little bit of basil at home. And we're going to add a pothos and maybe a little daffodil to this mix. So we'll see what we can fit. And basically what you can fit in the top, as long as it's not all the same type of plant, then we're going to be fine because they won't directly compete for nutrients, and that mycorrhizae will connect them together as a team. So many of you have probably bought these basils before, and I'm sure they have died because they are not designed to grow like this. And a lot of people think, I've had many friends tell me, oh, I'm horrible, I can't even keep those basils from the grocery store alive. And this is never meant to stay alive. Basils can actually grow to be a bush that is more than 3 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, one single plant. And if we look here, we've got like 30 of them. This is like if you had 30 people in a one-bedroom apartment. It's just not going to work. You may survive a few weeks, but that's it. So this is what this is for. It's for you to get basil home on the counter and eat it. Though we can actually save this. We can take it, and what we're going to do is we're going to tease out some healthy candidates. And this will be a beautiful candidate of root-bound pot. So we're going to look for some nice big healthy ones on the side here, and we're going to tease these roots out a little bit. You gotta, when they're really bound like this, you gotta be a little rougher than you may be comfortable with. And we're just going to pull out a few candidates here that we're going to be working with. And you really need to tease them apart. So if they're really bound together, like really tightly, you can soak this in a bit of water and the soil will fall away and you'll loosen the roots off very easily. So if we're not able to do that, we might have to do that as well. But here we should be good. And there we go. So we've got now our one basil plant, and we're going to add this to the mix. So we're going to make a little hole and make sure that we don't go deeper than the roots that we've got here. We're going to use the same soil depth. And we're going to stick that little friend in there and top up the soil a little bit. And it will, over time, gain back its strength. But what we're going to do is I'm actually going to turn it. And the hyacinth is going to be its shoulder to lean on until it gets nice and strong. So that is adding our basil. Now we're going to stick a little more color in there. I'm going to add another little bulb here. Now the bulbs are harder to put multiples of in the same pot because the bulb itself takes up a lot of area. And these ones are incredibly root bound. See how tight those are? I've got to get a little bit more rough in there. I always hate doing this, even though it has to be done. You want to try and do this with the least amount of root cracking possible, but you're not going to get away with none of that happening. So some of it will happen definitely. So there we go. We've got our bulb that we're going to add to the mix, and I'm going to pull this. I think this side has a little more space. So I'm going to make my hole, and I'm going to go a little extra deep because we've got that nice big root ball. So I'm going to remove some soil. Give a little bit of space. And same thing that we did with the hyacinth, we're going to hold it up while we fill in the soil. And that's just going to give those roots a little bit more depth to work with. And make sure we put a little bit of soil between the roots and the side of our fabric pot. Now, everything's a little wonky right now. So what you can do is you can hold the plant in the position that you want, and with your fingers very lightly kind of gingerly go around the roots and tamp it down, but very lightly, and that will give it a bit more stability in the position that you are hoping to hold it. So the hyacinth is leaning a bit too much, so we're going to hold it up, and we're going to add a bit more soil on the side it's leaning to, and tamp it down. After your first watering too, things may shift, so you can feel free to adjust them after that first watering. And there we go, we've got these two. And I'm going to put in one little pothos. I really love the pothos because it's a very easy plant to grow. And you can, whenever this is growing, you can always take a cutting. Everywhere a leaf comes off is a node, and if you cut it below that node and put it in a glass of water, it'll set new roots, and you can get a new pothos. So this is one of the best plants to start with because you can just have an infinite supply of them at home. They don't have a very extensive root mass, which is another reason why they're great to add to any of your plant mixes. So we're going to put one right here. So I'm just going to make another little hole for it and sneak it in there. You can actually see this was a cutting that we took and rooted in the water. And anytime there's a plant that has a damaged leaf, it's slowly going to abort that leaf on its own, but in the meantime, it's feeding it nutrients. So you can always remove damaged leaves, and it will actually save some energy that will be wasted by your plant on trying to save it. All right, now we're starting to look a little more interesting. We've got 4 different plants in here. Some are ornamental and some are just for food in your pasta sauce. And one trick you can learn about basil is that this basil plant, you'll see there isn't a lot of basil growing on it, but you see these tiny little buds here on the side, the little baby ones? Those are secondary growth buds. And when you pinch your basil on the top, those too will grow out next. So whenever I transplant basil, I often will pinch the tip, and that actually gives it a sense of a bit of shock, and it will, instead of trying to grow new leaves right away, it'll look at its roots and regrow any damaged roots that came about in the transplant. So I always do that with basil, save that for pasta tonight, and then these 2 little shoots are going to be your next primary growth. And if you tip those again, you'll get 2 more, and tip them again, and that's how you get your 3-foot bush of basil. So we are ready to go. Make sure there are no roots exposed. I see a little bit of the pothos root here, or devil's ivy root that is exposed. And now we are ready to remulch. So we're going to just get that mulch in there, in and around every plant, and top it right up, because remember, when you do your first watering, it's going to settle down. So basically, when we're working with plants, if this is a big tree or something that's going to develop a massive root ball, then you want to make sure that you're not going to put other plants that also have really big root balls. So the basil is something that's going to actually want to have a fairly big root ball. The bulbs don't. The bulb has the bulb and a small amount of roots that come out below it, and the pothos as well doesn't. So we've got some small roots and then some deeper roots mixed. So the spacing that you're going to work with is, do you have room for another plant? We have maybe room over here for another basil, but because there's a basil right there, those are going to be too close together and they're going to compete against each other. If I had another plant that had a tiny root system, maybe another pothos cutting, I could put another pothos cutting here, but only because pothos has a very small root mass. So you're really looking at layering above ground, but also layering the roots that are in the below ground. All right, so now we are ready to get started. And what we're going to do is we're going to put this in our pot. And again, you want to kind of make sure that your corners are pointing down, because those are going to be your wick that are going to bring the moisture up. And there we go. We are ready to water the plant and watch it grow. All right, so when we are filling your reservoir, we're going to take our water. Remember, it's dechlorinated water. It's water that we've left out for 24 hours. And we're going to be basically pouring it in the reservoir until it's just at the surface of the container. We don't want the container to be fully submerged, because that means that our pot is going to be sitting in the water. So we add. So when you're filling, the reservoir will have a tendency to float, so make sure that you push it down, and so that we can make sure to not fill over the height of the reservoir. So here it's just at the height of the reservoir, a tiny bit over, so that's okay because the soil is quite dry. All right, now that your reservoir is full, make sure that your support is centered and your corners are pointing down, and we're going to place our pot in the reservoir. And what we want to do now is we want to just top up the plant with a tiny bit of water. We don't want to put too much. We're just trying to get it a little bit settled, get a bit of moisture in the top soil that we just added. And I don't like to pour it all at once. I pour a little bit, watch it soak in, pour a little bit more, watch it soak in, and a tiny bit more. And I'm going to do this a little bit drizzled on each plant so that the roots are wet directly. And there we go. So as these grow, and the next few days they may settle down a little bit, so again you can always kind of reposition them and just get them settled into the orientation that you want, and then watch it grow. And now with this type of technique, you can slowly transition all the plants that you have on your balcony and increase the amount of herbs or other, little tiny tomatoes are great if you have some sunshine. All kinds of these plants are really fun. I personally love saving the seeds of lemon trees or mangoes or things like that and putting them in the pots and watching them grow. Not that you're ever going to get a lemon or a mango, but it's a beautiful, fun experience to kind of watch these tropical foods growing on your balcony. So today we just learned how to do one simple technique of gardening in small spaces. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of different topics that we could go a lot further in detail into, and if you're interested in that, we have a workshop specifically on ecological gardening that's available online at our website p3permaculture.ca, as well as an urban permaculture workshop which looks at a much more vast urban perspective on ecological living. So all of these are available online, and if you just have specific questions about today's tutorial, or you want some information about your garden, about your balcony, about a rooftop, or anything that you're working on, give us a call at 438-228-5883, and I'd be happy to help you in your garden project, or you can write us an email at info@p3permaculture.ca. Thank you so much for joining us for this tutorial on gardening in small spaces. And don't forget to catch the next episode of We're All in This Together, which is on animal fostering with Cindy on April 23rd at 6 p.m.
When the sun is bright or in the darkest night, we're all in this together. I've got many friends, and you are one of them. We're all in this together. Ça va bien aller. I've got see you again at the rainbow's end, in fair or stormy weather. For love is like a smile that says see you in a while. We're all in this together.